This video contains disturbing content, sexual situations, and mentions of child abuse. Viewer discretion is advised. I caught sight of my reflection in the arrivals lobby at the airport. My dress wasn't sitting the way it should, and my posture was terrible. Why do these places have to line their walls with reflective metal anyway? It always made me feel so uncomfortable, like being trapped inside a cookie tin. The plane had already landed. His plane. Any moment now, I'd see him walking through the doors. It wouldn't be like the movies. I knew that. The sheer amount of people coming through meant I wouldn't even spot him right away. He might not see me slinking back against the pillar either, so he'd probably walk a bit and then stand around confused. I imagined him trying to get on the Wi-Fi so he could call me, cursing all the steps it took to get a couple of bars of internet. Then he would either call or text. Probably call. Or text? I kept shifting my weight. Right foot, left foot, right. I probably looked like I was trying to dance or just needed the bathroom. My palms were sweaty, and I kept wiping them on the sides of my dress, pulling it down, setting the seams off my waist. Pretty soon, he'd wonder if I'd been out in the rain because the sides of my dress would be drenched in anxious palm sweat. I would lie. I would say, yes, it was the rain. Summer rain. On my hips. The crowd thinned, with few other flights arriving. Any moment now, I would see him. My mind would stop screaming and there would be calm. Another 5 minutes passed. Then 10. He wasn't there, and I began to worry.
Hi.
His breath tickled my ear. Hi, I exhaled, turning to face him. Months of underlying fears and anxieties fell away as every muscle in my body relaxed. It was him. The guy in the photos, videos. It was the voice from our calls. Carl's shy smile lit up his face as he took me in. I saw my own feelings reflected in his elated, nervous gaze. I went in for the hug, digging my chin into the crevice of his neck, inhaling his skin with audible greed. I felt him doing the same with my hair as he held me close. I don't know how long we stood like that, wordless, motionless. We always talked about how we would kiss when we saw each other, but it felt wrong in the moment. Eventually, we started walking toward the exit. We made small talk, the same way we did in our calls. The heaviest small talk I'd ever experienced. A mist of words concealing a mountain of hopes, desires, and fears. The hotel non-dormant was within walking distance, just as we had planned it. There would be no need for sightseeing. Maybe we can stop at the hotel bar first? I asked, panic rising within me. It was stupid, really. All I wanted was to take his hand, entwine our fingers so I could feel his pulse beating against my own. A simple, innocent action I couldn't perform, when we were here to do so much more.
Sure,
he said, still smiling, still shy. He knew what I was feeling, of course. There were no guessing games to be played between us. I tried not to look at the ring on his finger, but it reflected the sunlight outside, blinding me for a second. I wondered about her, the woman he called honey or dear as he kissed her goodnight, the one he shared his real life with, not this fantasy mindfuck we've been building through secret texts and phone calls. The two of them had been through thick and thin, and here I was, hoping to bulldoze it, helping him flatten a whole other life into the ground. It felt so dirty, so sick when you put it like that. I imagined his children hating me for taking Daddy away, and the knot in my stomach became a dry heave in the back of my throat.
Are you okay?
He asked after we checked in and settled in at the bar. A little nervous, I croaked, my voice that of a dying woman. I cringed at the sound.
Me too.
He agreed, unaffected. The bartender took our orders, and my eyes lingered on the man's surgical mask. What a character, I thought. before turning to meet Carl's gaze head on. I'd never felt it before, our difference in age. But right then he seemed so much older, more tired, a man that carried words on his shoulders. I decided to shut off my mind. Whatever the odd bartender had poured was doing the trick, and my muscles were loosening up. I arched my back, pretending to stretch. Carl darted a glance at my chest and smiled to himself. I wasn't fooling anyone. I took his left hand in mine, tracing patterns along the veins protruding between his knuckles. Our banter grew more comfortable as we joked around, our underlying lust growing into something much bigger than anything we could ever hope to control. It wasn't long before we were taking the elevator to our room on the 20th floor. Hours later, Carl collapsed on top of me after our third and slowest session. Tears welled in my eyes as I curled up in his arms. The drunken haze was wearing off and sober doubts came creeping in. For a second, I wondered if he'd held his wife this same way the night before he got on the plane to see me. Those thoughts were unwelcome, so I chose to focus on the way he smelled instead. The scent was intoxicating, and I wanted to bottle it for when I was left on my own again. We must have both passed out just like that, holding each other, peaceful at last.
It's time to get up.
A man's voice brought me out of the depths of my sweet slumber. I kept my eyes closed, feeling the pleasant sensation of Carl's arms still wrapped around me. I'd never had that before. In the past, cuddles were something to do before sleep, and I'd never been comfortable with being held through the night. It felt right with Carl, though. So wrongly right.
Wake up.
This time, my brain registered the alarming presence of another person in the room. I sat up in bed, pulling the sheets up to cover myself. The man from the hotel bar stood in front of the door. His eyes were serious, his posture commanding. A different surgical mask concealed the bottom half of his face. This one was light purple and matched the surgical scrubs he changed into. "What the fuck?" I cried, shaking Carl awake. It took a second for him to stir, and I felt his body tense as he processed the scene in front of us. We both stared at the bartender, who grinned with his eyes before disappearing into the bathroom. A second later, he emerged, wheeling a table in front of him. He positioned it at the foot of our bed before swiftly pulling out a dark bottle and 2 shot glasses.
So, it's truth serum time.
He announced cheerfully. I reached for Carl's hand and he gripped my palm reassuringly.
I think you should leave.
Carl's voice was respectful, but firm.
I think not.
The bartender replied dismissively as he busied himself with pouring the steaming clear liquid into the shot glasses.
Call the front desk.
Carl whispered to me, and I grabbed the receiver of the phone on my bedside table. I was saved the trouble of figuring out how to dial the front desk by a pre-recorded message sounding in my ear. "Hello, you've reached the front desk of Hotel Non-Dormient. We're not here right now, and neither are you. Not really. If you want to order room service, you can do so through our laundromat in the basement. But beware the faulty plumbing. If you want to report an issue with your room, feel free to send a complaint by carrier pigeon to our central office. If you've received a visit from our bartender, rest assured that it was warranted on our end." A click, then silence. Carl's eyes searched my face and I shrugged. Our situation was growing more bizarre by the minute, and a deep sense of dread settled in my stomach.
Now, see here.
The bartender addressed us sternly.
There is a reason you two wound up in this hotel on your very first night together. Several issues need to be addressed now that you're here, and it would all be done away with much easier if you cooperated.
Yeah, no, fuck this.
Carl got out of bed, quickly grabbing his clothes off the floor.
We'll be calling security, so it really would be best for you to leave.
He added after pulling on his boxers and plaid pajama bottoms.
I was afraid you'd make this difficult. Yeah. Here we go then.
He added before snapping his fingers. The hotel room began to shake violently. The momentum thrust me back and forth until a particularly turbulent jerk propelled me out of bed. The last thing I remembered was a sting at the back of my head as I hit one of the bedposts on my way to the floor. I awoke to the sound of loud music blaring. I opened my eyes to see neon lights flaring in rhythm with the beat. I was sitting in a worn leather armchair, facing a podium stage with a pole in the center of it. I winced as something brushed the back of my right hand. It was the bartender, who sat in an identical armchair to my right. Instead of scrubs and surgical mask, he was wearing an all-black outfit with a scarf covering the lower half of his face. I was dressed in a t-shirt and jeans that I'd never seen before.
Brace yourself for this.
He shouted over the thudding music. "What?" I cried out, bewildered. Where were we? Where was Carl? Some jeers and whistles announced the beginning of the show. A school-aged girl stumbled out from behind the curtain. I wasn't sure whether it was obvious drug haze or the 9-inch platforms that were hindering her movements. Probably both. The poor child was fully nude, her barely developed body shivering, her pale skin goose-pimpled. The girl began gyrating against the pole in the middle of the podium. Her hollow eyes focused on a single spot in the back of the room. Occasionally, the neon strobe lights revealed men sitting in armchairs in darkened parts of the room. My stomach churned when I saw that several were rubbing themselves through their pants.
This is what will happen to baby Jean if you keep waiting for a man who will never be yours.
My mouth fell agape as the naked girl flipped her hair out of the way to reveal a very distinct birthmark under her right ear. My infant daughter had the very same one.
If she grows up without a healthy father figure in her life, she will seek attention elsewhere. And she'll start young.
The bartender's words were no longer contesting the music. He spoke calmly from inside my head. She won't, I stammered, anxiety rooting me to the spot. I wanted to run up to the stage to cover up this impossible apparition of my daughter, but I couldn't move.
Do you really believe that you and Carl can build a life together? That he'll be there for you and Jean when he has his own children to think about?
The bartender asked before the room began spinning. Somehow, I was back in our hotel room, clothed in a bathrobe, sitting on the bed with Carl at my side. His fists were clenched, his breathing uneven. Something told me I wasn't the only one that had just taken a trip to an alternate reality. I reached for his hand, but he flinched at my touch.
Sorry.
He gasped, realizing what he'd done. But the wound was permanent. The TV screen on the wall in front of us came to life. The contents of the video were all too familiar and shameful. It was one of the special videos I'd recorded for Carl. My naked self moved seductively on the screen as I pleasured myself to thoughts of him. I had to look away, first at my trembling hands, then at Carl himself. His pained expression softened as our eyes met, and he wrapped an arm around me.
Look, I don't know what the hell this is, but we're going to be okay.
His voice quivered as he spoke into my hair. A relieved sob escaped my lungs and I dug my nose into his chest.
It could be a blackmail attempt,
he reasoned. A new scene came to the corner of my eye and I looked back to the screen. It was a video recording of a family living room. A boy and a girl who looked a lot like Carl sat facing the camera. The boy was on the couch while the little girl sat on the rug. A pretty woman with kind eyes and an intelligent face sat in an armchair. She was dressed in a cozy-looking sweater with her hair tied up in a matronly bun. So that was her then. His wife. A dark figure slinked into the room. It wasn't the shape of any man I'd ever seen. It was too long and tall. The shape jerked unnaturally as it moved, making me doubt the authenticity of the recording. It looked a lot like a poorly edited YouTube jump scare video. The figure lingered behind the couch, stretching an arm to reach the boy.
Where's my phone?
Carl demanded, jumping out of bed to rummage through his things.
Where the fuck is it?
I kept my eyes glued to the screen as Carl proceeded to tear the room apart. He looked behind the armchair, in the bathroom. He tried the door to the other room, but it was locked from the outside. We were trapped. The figure on the screen was now sitting on the couch next to the older boy. 2 small dots glowed in the spot where the thing's eye should have been. The family on the screen didn't seem to register the foreign presence in the room. "It's not real, Carl." I kept my voice steady. "Look at it. It's an obvious video manipulation." The figure tilted its head at my words, and I caught a hint of a Cheshire grin spreading across the shadowed face. The leer wasn't visible on camera, but there was no doubt it was there. The creature got up from the couch and moved to the armchair where the woman sat, jamming its shadow arm down her throat. I'd like to say it was about elbow deep, but it was hard to tell what sort of joints, if any, the entity had. The woman's mouth stretched unnaturally to receive the abuse, her eyes staring blankly ahead. She didn't scream. The youngest child, a girl who couldn't have been older than 5, got up from her place on the rug and walked up to the camera until her face obscured the disturbing scene in the background.
"Why did you go away, Daddy?"
The girl's left eye asked the camera lens.
"Why did you leave us?"
I tore my eyes away from the screen to see Carl standing helplessly in front of the door. His shoulders drooped, his gaze distant. What had we done? Here were the results of our mutual selfishness and disregard for everyone involved. I got up and walked over to him, wrapping myself around his waist. The screen went blank as we stood locked in a macabre embrace. There was a knock on the door. I barely had a chance to react before the lock clicked open and the bartender walked in, slamming the door behind him. He pulled the dark bottle from behind his back and placed it on the vanity mirror table. 2 shot glasses followed.
Now, folks,
We watched the man's mouth move behind the surgical mask.
it's nearly checkout time, and we have a really strict policy about that. No extensions, with the exception of death. Hopefully it won't come to that here.
"What do you want with us?" I asked, clinging to Carl, feeling his arms tightening around my waist.
I've already told you, it's truth serum time.
The bartender replied, unflinching.
The 2 of you have set something in motion, and it needs to be addressed. Just one of the many services we provide here at the Hotel Non-Dormient.
We stared at the strange man. No sort of reply seemed appropriate.
Are you ready?
Our captor's eyes twinkled.
Yes.
Carl said as he released me and turned to face the bartender.
What do we have to do?
Well, let's see.
The man started digging around in the pockets of his scrubs.
Here we go.
He exclaimed, pulling out a thin stack of note cards. He studied the first 2 on the pile, shook his head and shuffled the stack.
February 13th. Ring any bells?
His eyes engaged mine. I was about to reply when he put up a hand to silence me. He poured some steaming clear liquid into a shot glass and handed it to me.
Drink.
He commanded. I complied, draining the shot glass. Another blink. Another reality. I was in the same living room I'd seen on the TV, only now it was empty. Except for Carl, that is, who sat on the couch with a laptop resting in his lap. I called to him, but he didn't hear me. I guess I wasn't really there. Was I a shadow figure? I walked over to Carl, my eyes devouring him head to toe. I let my gaze linger intimately on the features I loved the most, like his neck, hands, hair, mouth, eyes, all of him, basically. He was dressed casually in jeans and a hoodie and wore a big smile on his face as he typed away on the laptop keyboard. I slipped onto the couch, wrapping my body around his back. There shouldn't have been enough space for me to hold him like this, but in this alternate reality, I managed to squeeze right in. I laid my head on his shoulder, feeling his warmth. Carl's body language was erratic. He tensed one moment, then relaxed. He would smile, then grow serious. In the past, he'd claimed that he had felt my presence with him, and I wondered if it had been my shadow self all along. I already knew what would be on the screen. Reluctantly, I drew my attention to see the all too familiar image of our chat window. I always want to say something, and I say it in my head a lot, but I'm scared of typing it. It just feels stupid, like it can't really be.
You mean, I love you? That thing?
Yes, I love you. That thing.
Because I do. I love you.
I love you too. Carl's hands lay motionless on the keyboard, and he seemed to have stopped breathing. I remembered myself in that moment we'd said it. I'd sat exactly like this, alone in a room with a screen that felt more like a bomb than a device. I clung to him tightly, wishing for him to feel the sincerity of the words on the screen. I wanted to melt into him, to become a part of his body and go wherever he would go.
Big words from someone you've never even met at that point, don't you think?
The bartender had appeared in the armchair. The surgical mask and scrubs were now a dark shade of green. Yes, I pulled myself away from Carl as I got up from the couch, preparing to recite all the explanations for our predicament. Words that had become an inner coping mechanism, a mantra of defense. For some reason, I couldn't utter a single excuse, not one word of justification.
This is truth serum time.
The bartender explained, nodding slowly.
There is no hiding from the facts.
Yes, very big words, I said, exhaling with my whole body.
You don't doubt it?
I do, I whispered.
What's that? Louder for the records, please?
The bartender mocked. Of course I have doubts. There's nothing easy about our situation, okay?
Okay, so what's the solution?
The bartender raised an eyebrow. I don't fucking know, okay? I spat back. I just know nothing else in my life has ever felt so right. No one else has ever felt so much like home.
So, what's the solution?
The bartender repeated. Carl's son and daughter entered the room, and he closed the laptop, setting it aside on the coffee table. The daughter stared right at me before charging ahead. With a shout, she ran through me, or whatever version of me was in that room. The collision tore me in half, causing fragments of my shadow self to dissipate in the air. Consciousness flickered once, twice, then all was black. Room 2004. Again. The fainting spells, time travels, hallucinations, or whatever they were. They'd taken a toll on both of us. Carl sat on the opposite end of the room, slumped in a corner. There were cuts on his face that weren't there before I took the truth serum, and his eyes were bloodshot from crying. I wonder where he'd gone, what he'd seen.
Dear guests,
The bartender sauntered in from the bathroom.
it's almost checkout time, but there is one incredible deal we offer our most sympathetic room occupants. We call it the Guilty Lovers Special, and it's quite a bargain.
I looked at the bartender, who was now dressed in hotel uniform, a generic surgical mask covering his face as usual. I observed Carl's detached, morose face. Neither one of us said anything.
What is the special, you ask? Well, just this once, the Hotel Non-Dormant grants you the opportunity to turn back the clock.
The bartender enthused.
You can go back to any time in the past, choosing to erase or keep all memories of what's happened in the time you've reversed. In your case, we recommend going back to the time before the two of you started talking. However, even a simple 24-hour reversal would do the trick. Don't you think?
The bartender spread his hands in a whimsical gesture, inviting us to accept his offer. I looked at Carl and he looked back at me. The sadness I felt was reflected in his large, brooding eyes. I tried to prepare myself for the inevitable pain of rejection, but Carl only shook his head before standing up to speak.
No,
He said, turning to the bartender.
I pass.
As you wish.
The bartender bowed respectfully before turning to me.
And you, madame?
No, thank you, I choked out. The bartender's eyes softened as he looked from me to Carl.
We hope you've enjoyed your stay at the Hotel Non-Dormant. What we lose in comfort, we make up for in attention to customer care. The spiritual health of our customers is very important to us, and our cleansing rituals account for 3 of our 4-star rating. Please be sure to sign our guest book on the way out. It ensures that none of our staff can sneak out of the premises with you after you leave.
With these words, the bartender bowed again before turning around and walking out of our hotel room, kindly leaving the door open behind him. We sat quietly side by side in the departures lounge. Any moment now, they would announce final boarding for Carl's flight. We'd called home to make sure our families were okay. Everything was fine on both ends. So the things we'd seen in our room at the Hotel Non-Dormient had not actually happened, or so we agreed. I eyed the giant digital clock above the departures screen. The numbers changed mercilessly, and I felt every second slipping away, burdened by unspoken words, forever lost in collateral silence. I would have to say something before he left, and I didn't want it to be a hollow goodbye. "Why did you say no?" I asked Carl quietly, afraid to look him in the eye.
Because
He sighed deeply, taking my hand in his.
the only thing worse than our fucked up situation is the thought of never having met you at all.
I turned to face him, braving his penetrating gaze as I tried to find the right words to express what I was feeling. He continued before I spoke.
There are so many things to doubt, so many lives are affected by what we're doing.
He trailed. "Are we bad people?" I interrupted him.
No, because then this wouldn't be so painful. If we were bad people, we wouldn't care.
"Can we really make this work?" I asked, afraid of the answer.
Maybe not right now. Not without destroying lives, I guess.
He said, pawing my hand with both of his.
But I have to believe we'll be together one day. Things may line up on their own. Secrets this big have a way of manifesting themselves.
"One day." My voice trembled.
Yes.
He nodded.
And you said no, too.
"I did." I spoke cautiously, aiming to keep my voice steady. "I can never regret finding the one person who truly sees me." I let myself cry silently into his shoulder then, quiet and snivelly. Those were our last moments together. And when he left, I walked zombie-like through herds of people and out of the automatic airport sliding doors. I decided to pass by the strange hotel on my way to the train station. It wasn't much of a surprise to see an abandoned construction site in the place where the Hotel Non-Dormient had appeared to us. Wherever we had actually been the previous night, it wasn't a place just anyone could find. However, something told me that it would always be there for those who really needed it.